Welcome to Kinwise Conversations. Today we're talking to Dr. Sawsan Jaber, a global educator, equity strategist, community activist, and national board certified teacher. As an award-winning leader, Dr. Jaber's work is rooted in her lived experience as the daughter of refugees and her profound belief in humanizing education and empowering students through voice, agency, and radical love. If you've ever felt the tension between the need for standardization and the call for true student-centered learning, this conversation is for you. We'll explore how to view teaching as a liberatory skill, how AI forces us to finally ask what's truly essential to teach, and Dr. Jaber's framework for building classrooms as healing spaces that nurture the next generation of scholar activists. Let's dive in. Hi, thank you so much for being here with me, Dr. Jaber. I'm so excited to hear about your story and your story in education, your foundational beliefs, what's led you to the place where you're at. And so to get us started, I want to give you an opportunity to share with listeners a little bit about who you are so they're oriented to the person that they're hearing from today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you as well. I like to introduce myself as a storyteller. Anytime I present or if I'm doing keynotes, I always introduce myself as a storyteller because I feel like I am the amalgamation of stories of my ancestors, whether it is my Palestinian ancestry and my family who was displaced time and time again until my parents came here as refugees in the 1960s, or my ancestry as a Muslim and the stories that are in the Quran that really define my character and who I am as a person and how I show up in spaces, or my ancestry as an American and with having people like Dolores Swift and Martin Luther King who really carry my legacy as someone who fights for justice for all students in classrooms and roots a lot of my work in equity based on those three identities. I am an educator, currently an assistant professor at a university in Illinois. I've been in education. This is my 26th year, which feels like a super long time. I've been teaching since I was 19, so now everybody knows how old I am. It's my first year at a university. My experience has been in K through 12 education for 25 years. I've really done it all from teaching, which was my favorite job, to director of curriculum, department chair. I've worked at a state policy level and written national standards and done a whole bunch of different things in education. I consider myself a global educator because I've worked with different countries and really had the opportunity to see what education looks like in so many different places. And I feel like I bring that perspective into my work and working with students here in the United States.
That's incredible. I feel like you have a very expansive story and identity that plays into your perspective and your purpose as an educator. You've been in education for a long time, but in the past decade, we have all seen a lot of changes that have impacted students and our educational environment. And so I'm curious, in your perspective, what have been some major shifts that you've seen that have particularly impacted how students express themselves or feel seen in the classroom?
I think it's really interesting because I feel like education is that swinging pendulum, right? Like with
Yeah.
No Child Left Behind and ESSA, we saw a real move towards students being statistics and kind of numbers and the grades and standardization of education, which is super scary because that makes kids invisible. It makes their lived experience invisible because we're focusing so much on the quantitative that we lose the qualitative piece of the students and the street
Mm.
data of who they are and the kind of the holistic piece. And we move from a humanizing space to a very factory based space. And I feel like post COVID, those things kind of became really highlighted. And so the move and the push became to push back and to humanize students by following the qualitative data, by looking at who students are, by seeing the stories and talking more about equity, even though I feel like a lot of that kind of translated in very performative ways. When we talk about equity, every school and every district came out with an equity statement, right? And in a lot of ways, when those became actionable, they didn't, in so many spaces, didn't really actually move student experiences in schools.
Mhm.
Up until the last year, we were trying as schools to figure out what it looked like to actually meet students and give them voice and center their experiences, make them feel seen and represented in schools beyond single stories. Which we started talking more expansively about mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, and cultural responsiveness, and culturally sustaining pedagogies, and differentiation, and student-centered pedagogies. Like all of these things became front and center. And now that pendulum is kind of swinging the other way again. And a lot of those very conversations are being labeled as un-American. And students that we were trying to meet their needs are now being targeted in sociopolitical context. And so it feels like that seat that we were working super hard to give them at the table is now being pulled from under them. We're scrambling to figure out what it looks like to meet their needs in a socio-political climate that is explicitly targeting those very students, regardless of their identity, whether it's our Black students, our Latinx students, our Arab students, our transgender LGBTQ plus students, like all of our students that are at the margins. The work now becomes within our locus of control as educators. How can we still continue to give these students voice and agency to really provide spaces that are seeing them from a holistic sense and from an asset pedagogy? And how do we push back against these larger systems that keep telling our students, those students particularly, that they're not good enough, and continue to feed into like an identity of radical love, like that they see themselves from the lens of radical
Mhm.
love. We radically love them in order for them to be able to continue being able to construct a reality that's different than the one that we're currently living in. Because I believe that our classrooms should be healing spaces where work happens. And the absence of these conversations and the absence of criticality and inquiry in our classrooms is what led to us being in this space where many people just believe what they hear and are okay with the single stories that they have of people with specific identities. And so there's so much fear because we don't understand each other. And a lot of that is eliminated when we have deep understanding below the iceberg of people who are different than us. And so when we have classroom spaces that can take the skills, right? The biggest pushback that I hear from teachers when I'm doing this work with teachers in my consulting or in keynotes is, but I have all this curriculum. How do I get through it? So the beauty of teaching in this way is making the skills that we want students to learn meaningful. For example, I am an English teacher, and when I told my students about grammar, we don't talk about a period being the end of a sentence. We talk about a period being where where your reader is forced to sit in your words and really think about them, right? So that period has power. We talk about rhetoric as claiming your voice and having power to convince someone of something that is important to you. The question becomes, what is important to you? Why is it important to you? And who do you want to talk to about that? And all of a sudden, this idea of audience and writing skill and all of those are the skills that I need to be teaching as a high school English teacher, but they have a different layer of meaning because they become liberatory skills. They become skills that are a lifeline for students. They help to shift the power back to kids who have historically been stripped of their power in school spaces so that they're able to self advocate and even more importantly, choose pathways for themselves that are their choice, not a system or society that decides that this child, because of his or her identity, belongs in this space. But I get to decide as an individual, as a human, where I want to be, what I want to do, and what my future looks like, and what the future of this country as a global citizen with a deep understanding of what that means looks like as well. And so I feel like we're trying to preserve what it means to give students voice and agency in a space that is trying to standardize and erase and assimilate in a sociopolitical climate that's trying really hard to assimilate all kids.
It's interesting because when you were speaking, I felt like why learning happens felt so clear to me. Like when you talked about a period being a point for someone to stop and sit in your words, that's such a powerful example of how teaching grammar can be deeper than just this is where you put this punctuation, but this is why we put this punctuation in the place we put it. And this is what it means. And here's how you can use that to elevate your voice. And that's a skill that's useful in school and throughout life, understanding how the tools that you learn are actually usable. And I think there's a lot of discussion in the AI space about how we have to teach students like why they're doing things and how to use the tools that they have effectively. Because if we don't teach them how to use them effectively, then there's the risk of decline of critical thinking or just not being prepared for a rapidly changing world. And so I guess as I listened to you talking about how we were thinking about the qualitative, we've swung toward the quantitative. And there's also this emerging technology that I think has raised a lot of questions about what does the future of work look like? How do we make sure people like critical thinking is of the utmost importance? We have to understand the why. These are things that feel connected. Like how are you thinking about preparing students for the future in a world where there's so much push toward quantitative standardization, which I feel like can reduce your critical thinking and your ability to see things how they really are.
I think teaching is an art, right? And like with any art, it's a balance, right? There's something beautiful in the traditional And then there's something beautiful in the innovative and the new. And so as a teacher, I feel like it's really important for you to find a way to mold is that we create spaces for students, right? I am in my role, not because of me, but because I'm there to serve. We can't continue to use pencil and paper, which is where people are running back to because they're worried that students are going to use AI to write papers. So many people are reverting back to traditional ways of assessing, but they haven't changed their assessment, and the world outside is changing. Professions are changing. My daughter was hospitalized a few months ago, and they had an AI robot assess her before the doctor did. They're piloting this AI nursing robot. The reality is the fields are going to change, and what we're preparing students for with AI transforming and the innovation around AI happening so quickly, we don't even know what we're preparing them for. And so, what becomes central is the question that teachers need to be asking. What are the skills that really become central in a time where these tools are being developed? And how do we embrace them in a way that is still building criticality, innovation, and really not losing the humanity in education? Because I feel like that is where there's that contention that we can lose the people that we've been trying so hard to bring back into the education. And that starts with first getting students to recognize and realize why they're there and why the learning is important to them. We've lost that because in so many school spaces, as an educational leader, a lot of teachers will come back and say, but I love teaching this novel. Okay, great. Read it on your own time. It's not about you in this moment, right? What do your students love? And how can we get them to see the power in the learning and the need for this learning? So it starts with intrinsic goals. That's one of the things that I was really big on as a department chair is that when we're writing skill-based goals, that we are pairing them with intrinsic goals of why kids need to do that learning. And it's not just because I said so and I'm the person in power in the space, but it's because it appeals to you, your positionality, your humanity, your sense of holism in this way. This is why we need to develop. And that's co-creating, right? It's also letting go of some of your power and sitting alongside students and listening to them and getting to know them on a deep level and saying to them, who are you? What is really important to you? Why is it important to you? Where do you want to be? Like, what is your dream, your radical dream for yourself, your radical dream for your community? And what can I do in my content area as an educator to help you reach those goals? And now I can set intrinsic goals that are really important. And that's not to say that AI can't shift what it looks like. Do we really need to have students writing 5-paragraph essays? Is that the most important thing? Or do we need to get students thinking more critically about what creative writing looks like, or what modes of writing are more appealing, or what modes of writing have more power? When we're doing research, do we need students to go into the library and actually research, or is it just as powerful for them to ask AI what the resources on this topic are, and then for them to be critical about what AI has produced and really kind of question who's in this list, whose voices are missing from this list, why are they missing? What is a good resource? How do I go in and really dig into, is this a reliable resource for my research? The criticality piece that's necessary can still be built in while using the new technology and innovation that AI has to offer, right? It's about word usage, like even generating images. I've never been an artistic person, but in all of my teaching, I incorporate a lot of art because I feel like there are students who speak art a lot more fluently than they do speak with words. And so giving them that multimodal way of expressing their learning has always opened a lot of opportunities and doors. And so like even I don't have to pick up a paper and a pencil anymore to create art, but my descriptors, how do I write a descriptive explanation for AI to create the image that I envision in my mind? There's a lot of word choice there. There's a lot of conversation about adjectives and kind of how do we create strong images. And that in and of itself can translate into when I'm writing, how do I take that skill in order for me to get the reader to see what I see in my mind when I'm trying to create something? So it's transferable, right? So it's a marriage of like both the new and the old in order for it to be impactful. And I don't know that there's a formula for that. I feel like that is very much in response to the students that are in front of you, in response to your content area. But it also means that we have to be willing to let go of some of the things that we have, especially if you're a seasoned teacher. But even if you're not, many teachers tend to replicate the ways that they've learned as learners. And so I feel like that way of thinking about education requires a lot of unlearning and a lot of risk taking that in our field isn't always so welcome.
Right. As you were talking about the clarity of communication that you need to draft a prompt, to create an image. I used to teach English too. And something I thought about is the purpose of writing something isn't necessarily just to write, it's to develop your own perspective and communicate an idea to someone else. And so there's a lot of different ways to communicate your perspective to another person. You can make an AI generate an image, and it requires some really precise and creative language to be able to communicate the idea in the way that you want it communicated. Communicate your idea and not an idea that's been changed in a way that isn't representative anymore by the machine. And so I think there's such a criticality that's involved in being able to use new tools effectively. And is an essential skill in a world where we're operating with technology that acts human, that's trained on data that could be biased, that hallucinates, all of these risks that exist. But I think it opens up some kind of opportunity for there to be this really rich discussion about how we interact and how we communicate in this world.
Can I add to that and just say, like, I also think it forces us to really think about how to harness love for education again, right?
Mm.
Like, it's not about writing to get a good grade anymore. It's about writing to reclaim your voice. So, like, I had a lot of multilingual students in my English class, and I always used to say, like, when we're writing poetry or anything, and you're writing a story about your grandmother, and your grandmother spoke a different language, and you want to kind of reiterate something that really rang true, something that she always said, or you're replicating something from a part of yourself that isn't necessarily something that everybody in your class is familiar with. And I'm the one that's grading the paper. You're not writing for me, right? You're writing for yourself and you're creating for yourself. And so, like, reigniting that passion for learning and that love to do the things that we've kind of killed that, right? By standardizing everything and by making everything contingent on a test score. And particularly with our students at the margins, telling them over and over again through these standardized ways that they're not good enough because they learn differently or their way of showing learning might look different. We've doused the fire that kids come into school with, that creativity and that like desire to learn. And so I feel like if AI is giving us the opportunity to do something, it's to reignite like ways of loving learning and education and the why for kids to like really find that passion again, because that's something that we've lost along the way anyway. It's about time that kids want to be in our spaces, that they want to be engaged, that they want to do the work, because like I said earlier, it's a lifeline. It's not just, I need to learn these things so I could do well on a test and get my score, and nothing is being built into that schema of long-term learning. But these are skills that I need in order for me to be an advocate and build a future that's better for my children and my grandchildren, because I can do that, right? Like, I have the power to be able to contribute as a global citizen. I call my students scholar activists, because everything that we do is rooted in that scholar. Like, education ultimately is what gets us to see each other from a human perspective. And so we have to start with educating ourselves deeply, and not just about our own matters, but about each other and about a global context. Because if technology's done anything, it's made our world so much smaller. The idea of cultural responsiveness also means being responsive to cultures outside of our local communities, because we don't know where students are going to end up in a technological sense. And then beyond that, it's how do I shift power dynamics in schools that have been set by giving them the opportunity to determine those things and determine what that looks like for them in the real world and what trajectory they want to take. So it's a power play. But in that power play, when we give students back that power, they all of a sudden find new meaning in learning, and it becomes something like, I'll give an example. I had a student named Eli, and we used to do every week, read one, write one poetry. And it was really about just bringing in multi voices that were not represented in our community and getting students to really think about identity in different ways. So the purpose was read one, write one. You're going to read one about this alternative identity. The goal is for you to create something that's yours. And so instead of me being the gatekeeper of what a window looks like or a mirror of you looks like, you're going to create a mirror that's an accurate representation of you. And through that, we are able to see kind of the complexities and nuances of different identities. And so the first time I assigned it, Eli came and he's like, Dr. J, I am not a poet. And I was like, you absolutely are. Everybody is a poet, right? But we just need to find that power and that gift that's inside of us. And so he's like, I really can't write poetry. And Eli, when he first came into my class, he said, everybody in this world thinks I'm a thug. That's how they view me. And I said, I'd like to unpack that more as we progress. And so Eli I was like, let's just journal. And so we started by like kind of just writing like just rough draft. Just throw everything up on a paper on something that's important to you. And don't worry about grammar. Don't worry about structure. Just write. And he did. And then I picked up a highlighter and I was like, highlight the things that really stand out to you. And so he highlighted a bunch of phrases. And then I was like, now take them out, type them on a document, stack them on top of each other. And he did. And then he read it. And I was like, okay, what do you think? And he's like, it sounds really good. And I was like, how can we make it better? Right? Like, how can we play with grammar to get people to pause, to stop in certain places that are important to you? How can you play with these words now to make it more impactful, to create these images? How do you paint with words? Right. And we read a little bit of Elizabeth Acevedo and Clint Smith to kind of show them what it looks like to paint with words. Show me, don't tell me. And then I said, now go back and try to replicate some of that in your own writing. And then he read it out loud. Every now and again, Eli pops up in my email or in my messages, and he'll share with me poems that he's writing at university level about things that are happening in his life. He constantly tells me how the class really helped him to kind of see himself not as a thug, but as a person who deserves to have a voice and a space. And writing his own story and telling his own story, but also advocating for the things that he finds important. I believe in the power of teachers. And I always say that teachers are the most powerful people in the world because we can use our curriculum as a tool to really build students and to give them their voices back and to create spaces where they see themselves as agents in this world that can contribute positively and to see themselves from an asset mindset, but to really love each other and to love each other enough to want to do well by each other and fight for justice for each other. Or it can be a weapon where we continue to destroy students and their self-concept in so many different ways, which is probably more common than not because that's what school structures have historically been built to do for our marginalized populations. I don't know that we have intentionally as a country yet done anything to universally disrupt that because every time we get a little bit closer, we swing right back to the way things are.
Right, that pendulum keeps happening, which makes it hard to make change. Because as you're like when you told that story about Eli, I think it's such a good example of how a teacher can take a concept or a standard and totally revolutionize not only a student's ability to interact with a content, but a student's perception of themselves. And I think I've had that experience as a learner where I've worked with a teacher who changed how I saw myself, and then my world was bigger, and I was able to be more effective in other spaces in my life. And I think your example with Eli is such a poignant story of how that can happen. Earlier in our conversation, you said that AI was an opportunity for schools to think about how to kind of redefine what learning is because we're, in a way, being forced to think about it again. How do we address assessment when students could use AI to replace their thinking? Do you have examples of people using this technology as a moment to redesign what's possible in learning? Or do you have ideas about what that could look like?
I think either schools have kind of just rushed in without taking the necessary precautions because like any new tool, like we are hearing stories about students who are forming emotional connections with AI bots and then committing suicide as a result of those
Mhm.
things. And so like the idea of like walking cautiously with this new tool that's new and exciting and everything that's new is exciting. It's like the shiny gold coin right now. And we obviously, and I know like careers are going to be contingent eventually on students' ability to leverage AI as a tool in a lot of different ways. So like staying away from it, which is the opposite of what like I've seen the two extremes. Like either we're going to avoid it altogether and go back to the traditional ways of doing things, or we're going to like adopt it full on, whether our staff and our students aren't fully ready. I think both of those are very scary scenarios. And again, it's about balance. Everything in life is about balance, right? It's about how do we prepare, how do we pause? Schools are not good at pausing. How do we pause and first teach our teachers and our students, right? And it's not a conversation of train the trainer. And this has got to be like an all in parents and community based education on what the benefits and the dangers of AI are and how we can leverage responsible use of a tool that it can shift a lot of things and take us. I always use this example. It's like a calculator. When the calculator came out, math teachers panicked, right? And now standardized tests have sections where students use a calculator because all of a sudden adding 2 + 2 is not the most important skill. We want to see if students can do something more. So where does AI draw that line? Like, where do we decide what the new necessary skills are to get students to really innovate in different fields and in different areas? And where can we say, okay, I'm going to let go of that 5-paragraph essay that now a student can just type in. You know, like I, in my classroom, have had students write and throw their essay into AI and ask AI, can you improve this based on like the criteria? and then print out and compare and contrast the AI version and their own version. And 99% of the time, they like theirs more because it's better, right? Because it's their authentic voice. And kind of really highlighting the things that maybe AI suggests that I can consider to do differently, and then taking both of those to write their own third draft. So AI is giving them an opportunity to see their work from a different lens, but they're not having AI write their paper. They're not losing the skill of writing. But at the same time, we're leveraging this tool because if we say that it's not acceptable in the space, kids are just going to gravitate towards it. So we bring it in with criteria of what's acceptable use and what's not acceptable use in a lot of different ways. I've had students, like I said earlier, think about what words they need to do to recreate an image that's in their mind and really think about word choice and audience in doing that. And then have their pictures. We do a lot of like picture book writing and other things like you're writing for a specific audience. Tell your story, your counter story as a marginalized group in the form of a picture book. So you're creating for your community maybe stories that you as a learner never saw about yourself. And instead of me trying to draw, because I used to introduce Mr. Stick as my mascot because I could not draw for the life of me, but I felt like there was a real power. And there's a lot of research behind using both sides of the brain when you're asking students to draw and write. So I would have them like learn about Mr. Stick at the first day of school because we did so much drawing, but now they can use AI tools to write and then use their writing to create images in that way so that they can put those things together. There's so many different ways, and we're just at the precipice. AI keeps changing so quickly that we can't even keep up with the best ways to integrate it. And I think that it's trial and error, right? Like with one group of students, something might work, and with another group of students, something completely different might work. And as it continues to progress, we need to keep growing. I don't know that I have the answers of what, but I know that if we don't find a way to balance the traditional skills with this innovation, we're going to lose creativity. And so AI is a direct threat to humanizing education if we don't find a way to balance it. And that doesn't mean that we're going to close the door and shut it out because that's not practical either. But it's about how do we really create these authentic learning experiences where students can leverage AI as a tool, but not lose their creativity, not lose the things that make them who they are, their unique individual selves, and not lose their ability to be able to speak to and advocate for those things that are important to their unique individual selves as well.
A lot of conversations I have with educators, it'll come up this idea of setting a culture and expectations around AI use in the classroom, like how you talk about that. And I'm curious for you, because you've talked so much about student identity, student empowerment, student voice. When you're working with a group of students and you're introducing a new technology, how do you go about building a shared norm or understanding of how that technology will show up in the learning environment?
I think it goes beyond the technology, right? I think it means just building relationships of trust at the beginning of any school year beyond the technology. The technology is just another barrier or tool, but it's also about building communities that we trust each other in this space. And so when I'm meeting as a department chair or curriculum director, as an administrator, or in my own classroom as an educator, I believe that the first 2 weeks of school should be solely focused on a deep dive in who we are as individuals and who we are as a community, and co-creating with students norms as a community and what's acceptable and what's not. Like, that's not stuff I walk into a class with. It's something that we develop together. And when we talk about like why we're here together and what we hope for this class to come out of it together, and we create those expectations as a unified group, and we spend the first few weeks of school really cementing that this is your space. I'm here to serve you, that the learning that we're going to do, and I always tell my students, if it's not going to make you better out there, then we're not doing it in here. This is about you, for you. It's all, you are the center of this space. I'm just here. I'm sitting among them. I'm writing with them. I'm learning with them. I'm in circle with them. I'm modeling what we call in Pedagogies of Voice, the 10 ways of being, and really kind of being vulnerable and sharing the power with the students in order for us to co-create together, in order for us to create this environment where if I'm struggling with something as a student, or if I feel like life is happening for me right now, and that is where students will most likely lean into AI because A, they don't feel like the learning is important to them. I've had students who are just going through so much that they don't have the time to complete assignments, and so AI becomes the first solution. Or they really are struggling with something and they don't have the tools to self-advocate or leverage the learning. So AI becomes the easiest go-to. And so when we can create communication lines and really build communication lines that are open and that students feel comfortable coming and saying, hey, Dr. J, I'm really struggling with this. Can we sit down and talk about it? Then I am creating a culture and ethos for for a classroom environment where we are a community of learners together and we can advocate and question and call out and call in each other all the time. And even if I'm feeling like, hey, here's are some of the ways that you can leverage AI for this project. Like, let's talk about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, right? Let's talk about that and determine that together as a group. Then all of a sudden, it's not you as a dictator and a ruler or the power in that space, but we have collective power and we've come to these collective decisions together. Does that mean that students aren't going to go into AI and generate their entire project? No, I've had those students too. Like, it doesn't mean I have 100% success rate of kids who love my class and want to write poetry and write essays, right? That's not the case. But when those things are happening in the classroom space, the humanity is centered and students want to do the work and their engagement is at a much higher level. And they see you as a proponent and a cheerleader of them and for them and a fellow learner. And I think when those kind of foundations are set, then the learning is more likely to take place in authentic ways that are going to benefit everyone. And I always say my students have always been my best teachers. They really have. I've learned more from my kids in the classrooms over the last 26 years than I have in any professional development, in any degree, in anything else. We learn from each other's humanity. And when we create spaces where our humanity can come to the surface in healthy ways, and we're not trying to we're diminishing the double consciousness that says you can only bring these parts of yourself into this classroom space. And we're saying all of you is welcome here, your languages, your lived experiences, your identity, your thoughts, your feelings, whether we agree or disagree. Let's find ways to communicate those disagreements and try to understand why they exist and still figure out how we can exist. I don't look like my students in 99% of the settings. I have a different faith. I have a different cultural, ethnic background. I have a different lived experience, but I can still be their biggest cheerleader and advocate, and I can coexist in community with them, and we can respect each other and love each other because we understand each other below the iceberg and on a deep level. And they know that anything that I am doing intrinsically and advertently is for them. It's not for me. And so I feel like that just changes the entire ethos, culture. It shifts the space entirely. And a lot of those issues, like I think I always say, I've never written a referral. In 26 years, I've never worked in a district and known how to write a referral or where they existed even. I've never needed to. And it's not because I'm this amazing teacher, but I think that students really want to be in the space and they want to do the work. And when there is a shift in behavior, then I can recognize that there's probably a shift in something that's happening in that student's life. And I can recognize it and address it in a way that resolves the issue before it becomes a behavioral issue or anything else. That 99% of our students who have behavioral issues are screaming to be seen in ways that when we're teaching in this way, we're seeing every single student and we're building communities of love that are healing in a context where we have so much hate and fear. I always ask, if one of those 5 police officers that we all watched murder George Floyd, just one, sat in a classroom where radical love was centered, where radical joy was centered, right? Where these kind of things were common conversation, would he still be alive today? It just took one. And so how can these classrooms shift the culture of hate and the culture of fear that exists in our country, one classroom at a time? It's such a powerful space. And I always say that our power is in our classrooms and not in Capitol Hill. Our power is in our classrooms to build humanity and elevate this humanity so that people understand each other beyond the single stories that they watch on the news or in a climate that tends to erase and diminish people's stories because it fits an agenda that's political.
Right. And, you're doing something really incredible in your classroom as you're talking. It's you almost get chills seeing this culture that you've built with your students and the way that's impacting the way that they see each other and see the world and are able to grow as people and learners. And, it's growing them in all of these ways and also growing you as their teacher because you're in community alongside of them. I think for a lot of educators, that feels really hard to get to. And so for people who may listen to this and think, that's amazing, how do I get there? What do you say to those people?
I would say that start somewhere. And in Pedagogies of Voice, the book that just came out, and Street Data, the book that precedes it, that Shane Safier wrote, Shane Safier always calls it a seed store. where you can go and kind of pick the seeds that make sense for you in order to grow your garden. And not just make sense to you, but that are right for your community of learners, right? Because there's no formula, there's no magic formula. I don't do it the same way, period one or period five, or in 2024 and in 2025. It really is in response to the world. Reading the world becomes our classroom curriculum. Integrating my students' lived experiences and their voices becomes central to our class curriculum. And so there's no way that you do all of those things and have a curriculum that you wrote in the summer that you repeat for the next 10 years, right? It's a marriage of letting go of power. There's an abundance of ways that you can leverage that. We have the agency framework, which is really 4 pillars. It's identity, belonging, inquiry, and efficacy. The idea too that when we do all of this kind of deep dive into ourselves and into each other, the question that I always ask my students is, now that you know, what are you going to do with what you know, right? The idea of making our learning public and actionable in order for us to shift and learn from each other becomes super central. And so I would say that if you really don't know where to start, those books are a great place to start. And even if you take one idea and refine it and just start somewhere, right? And then build another idea and another idea. I had teachers in my work as a department chair who really struggled with classroom management. And I was like, just try this little thing, and it was like so radical to them because it's really hard for teachers who studied in spaces where you're taught not to smile to Christmas and you are the main power source in the room and that you are front and center, you're the sage on the stage, you're the expert in the space, to let go of all of those things, to unlearn them, and to realize that those are what we call in Pedagogies of Voice toxins, right? And that they are really polluting the space as opposed to building these healthy communities. It's hard to do that. But when we have something to replace it with and we have a better way of doing it, and when we're willing to just kind of take a leap and try it, and we see students' responsiveness towards that, then it's encouraging because that return is immediate. When you shift your ways of being in the classroom, that return is immediate. And you then are going to hopefully be encouraged to continue trying things and shifting your ways, because that's what we expect learners to do, right? We expect them to come into our classes and take risks and try things. And we're sad and disappointed when they're not bold enough to try those things, or when we feel like there's so much apathy and their students are absent and kids aren't engaged. Like, we have so much to say that's a deficit thinking about students. And if we only would turn that mirror on ourselves, we would see that there is so many teachers like are not willing to try new things that make them feel uncomfortable. And if we're not uncomfortable, we're not growing. Normalize that discomfort as an educator. Start somewhere. Try, even if it's something small, perfect it and move on to the next thing. When there's room for growth and you're making that incremental change, there's no change that's too small. And if every couple of weeks you're trying something different, by the end of the year, all those small tries are going to equal into something super big. And you're going to be a different teacher with time, a teacher that is responsive to the students. How are we meeting this moment as educators? How are we meeting every moment, the moment that's coming? How are we, when we talk about the purpose of schools and we talk about like why we're educating kids, the antidote to all of that is by humanizing each other in these classroom spaces that center humanity, center our students. And when we center those that are most at the margins, we're really meeting the needs of everyone. And so I would say, if you really don't know where to start with Pedagogies of Voice. It's a great starting point that has a bunch of different on-ramps. And it also is written by 4 educators in 4 different areas of expertise from 4 different socio-racial ethnic backgrounds. And it was also written after talking to over 26 teachers and focus groups. So their voices are also included. There's so many student voices and teacher voices included in this book that helped to write this book that I would be shocked if anybody picked it up and said that they couldn't walk away with some things, plural, that they could take back into their classroom space or their educational space.
Well, it sounds like a great place to start and a great book that I'm going to have to check out after this conversation. I want to ask you a couple of more questions about AI specifically before we wrap up. The first is, as I know, Pedagogies as a Voice is a great place to start. And do you see opportunities for teachers to use generative AI in some way to help them start? Or have you thought about that or seen anyone do that?
I don't feel like AI isn't a tool that we can all use, right? Like, even if you're trying to create an experience, I feel like putting in like specific details. For example, I'm trying to create a lesson that integrates, here's the profile of my students, and here's the goal that I'm trying to create this lesson around, and here's the intrinsic goal. Can you help me generate some ideas of how to do that? And then taking it but being critical about what it produces and then implementing it, but making it your own at the same time, right? But not using it like in any time that you have a bunch of teachers coming into a room and we're thinking together. I don't walk away and say, I'm going to take Lydia's idea and just make it my own, but your idea might inspire me to create something that's my own. And I feel like AI is that could be that thought partner. Like it could be a place where we bounce off ideas and come back and say, like, hey, I can do it this way or I can do it that way. It can be your thought partner in a lot of spaces. But I don't think that we can take it blindly without worrying and remembering that AI is a man made tool. And there are biases and blind spots that are built into AI that we need to be interrogating and questioning and making sure that we are filling in the blanks and teaching kids to be critical of the same things, right? That idea of inquiry has to be front and center, whether the educator or the student.
Right. It's the same because it's not a perfect tool. It's a great way to get started. I could imagine reading Pedagogies of Voice and saying, okay, I learned this great strategy, and here's a profile of my classroom in a way that doesn't reveal student information. I get some ideas and I role play or I go back and forth, and then I'm able to implement that. But I can never put my brain on a shelf and just do what a machine tells me to do. I think there's a lot of fear around that for good reason, but as long as you maintain this sense of critical thinking and evaluation and center in your experience and your point of view and your understanding of who your students are, I think there's potential there.
I think what Pedagogies of Voice also helps us do is really think about mindset shifts.
Uh-huh.
We're talking about your student profile, right? Like what kind of a profile are we putting in there? It's not just how your students are faring with standardized testing, but it's like, what are their languages? What are their, for example, what are the ways that they like to learn? What are some interests?
Mhm.
Like when we even say profile, it's really defining what does a good student profile look like? That's where your teacher voice comes in and helps to feed some of that humanity into a tool that doesn't recognize humanity. It's a tool, right? It's a robot. It doesn't see the humanity in the people, but you as a teacher bring that human piece. And together you marry those to come up with something that is going to really be a productive or transformative experience for your students. But it requires us to kind of define that mindset shift of like, even when we think about profiles, we're not talking about the traditional profile that only standardizes our students and sees them from a perspective of a test score. But what are all the things that make our students human? Let's talk to AI about those things and then see what AI produces, because I believe that the product that AI would produce would be super different given those two different profiles.
I totally agree. And it would have to be because it uses those data points to feed you something. And if you only include test scores, you're going to get something very generic. But if you know that your students are into whatever they're into and where they live and what they enjoy, the languages, like you said, you're able to get such a richer picture and make it more connective. When people are connected to things, they're more interesting. And I think to them, and I think we all know that when we're in a conversation we care about, we're way more engaged than if someone is talking about something we have no interest in. And the same's true for our students. I want to end on our last question. I ask this to everyone, and it's, when you think about AI as a technology, a tool that can be used or misused, what is the biggest concern you have? Maybe something that's kind of sitting with you, and what's a hope that you have when it comes to this new technology?
My concern is I've heard in educational conferences, technology conferences, let's stop teaching kids to think. Let's just teach them to love. And that is such a to me, it's like where that dystopian thinking, it makes me think of Fahrenheit 451 and the Hunger Games, right? Like where we don't need you to think, somebody's going to do the thinking for you. You just learn to love. And that's so dangerous because critical thinking, the idea of the need for us to really think of our anti-racist thinking and the reforms that need to happen in our country and the revolutions that need to occur here, right? Like all of our revolutionaries, Martin Luther King, we think about Nelson Mandela, but we think about like the revolutionaries that really made shifts for humanity. They were all out of the box thinkers. And if we're not teaching kids to think innovatively, creatively, and differently and uniquely, and based on who they are and their own lived experience, then we are assimilating thought. And that is very dangerous and scary because we're giving up that power of criticality. If we look at systems of oppression in the past, from the stories of Frederick Douglass and others, oppressors have always wanted to keep literacy, reading, liberation from education from the oppressed, because that's a way of controlling people. And so there's something super scary about stop teaching kids to think and let AI do the thinking for them. Because again, AI is a man-made tool, and anything man-made is biased, flawed, is going to be limited, right? And so we don't want to limit our kids' thinking. It's also going to erase. And that idea of erasure, as a Palestinian today, the idea of erasure is so scary to me because I feel like I've never been represented in schools, which is why this type of teaching to me, I always wonder that if I had a teacher who taught me this way, my life would have looked completely different. And I might have learned to self-advocate way before my master's degree, where I started to read about equity and learned that now I have words to name experiences that I couldn't understand before. And my hope is that it'll force educators to really do some deep thinking about education and about the things that have never worked for us in the past, and to really consider how we can reform education in order for it to meet students' needs while integrating AI as a tool innovatively. Because I don't think that you can separate these things. Like, you can't separate the technology from the humanity. They are going to impact each other. Either, like I said, it's going to serve as a tool or it can serve as a weapon. And we, as the gatekeepers of what education looks like in classrooms, have the power to determine which way we're going to go. And it's about finding a balance of how to bring the old and the new together to create learning experiences that are authentic and transformative. And more importantly than anything today, the healing and the heart work that we need to heal larger communities.
That was an incredibly powerful conversation with Dr. Sawsan Jaber, a true advocate for radical humanization in education. We thank her so much for sharing her rich, asset-based perspective. 3 quick takeaways from our discussion. First, reignite the intrinsic why of learning. Dr. Jaber reminds us that if students don't see the power and necessity in the learning, they will gravitate toward tools like AI to cheat. When learning becomes the lifeline for self-advocacy and justice, engagement follows. 2, your classroom must be a community of trust. Building deep relationships and co-creating norms beyond just discussing technology is the foundation that allows students to be vulnerable, self-advocate, and responsibly leverage new tools like AI. Finally, AI must not lead us to stop teaching kids to think. We must use its innovative power as thought partners to enhance creativity, but we also must interrogate its biases and always keep criticality and inquiry front and center. To connect with Dr. Jaber, find links to her organization, Education Unfiltered Consulting, and her book, Pedagogies of Voice. Check out the links in today's show notes at kinwise.org/podcast. And if your mission-driven organization, school, or district is ready to move from conversation to action, Kinwise offers guided strategy experiences to help teams align AI use with their mission, values, and people. You can find more about our AI readiness roadmap and programs at kinwise.org. If you found value in this podcast, the best way to support the show is to subscribe, leave a quick review, or share this episode with a friend. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay Kinwise.